Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, GCC versus GCC High, which is right for your business. My name is Larita Baugh, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. I'm joined here today by Bill Wooten, Chief Revenue Officer here at C3 Integrated Solutions. Hi, Bill. As well as Scott Whitehouse, our Security and Compliance Practice Lead. Hey, Scott. Bill and Scott work closely with defense contractors to design, implement, and manage compliance-focused IT and cybersecurity solutions. So we couldn't get better experts for this topic. Today, we'll be talking about the flavors of Microsoft's government community cloud and the factors you need to consider when determining which is the best choice for you to meet your contractual obligations. But before we go ahead and get started with today's presentation, Bill, switch over to the next slide. I'd like to review a few of our logistics. Our webinar is scheduled to last about 30 minutes, though you may have seen an hour block in your time. That's just in case a bunch of you have some questions. We're going to be hanging out for a little bit after the 30 minutes to answer some of the questions that we expect will be coming in. The webinar will be recorded and made available for replay, and attendees will be muted during the call. But you're welcome to submit those questions at any time during the presentation. There's probably a questions box in the GoToWebinar control panel, which is probably on the right side of your screen. We'll answer as many questions as time allows at the end of the presentation. You'll also notice on this screen that there is a picture of an ebook, the Microsoft 365 GCC GCC High Buyer's Guide. We'll be offering that after the webinar as well to attendees. To take a look in detail of some of the stuff that Bill and Scott are going to be walking you through. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Bill. Bill?
Great. Thank you, Larita. First of all, Scott, thank you for joining me today. Originally, I was doing a solo, and when your schedule opened up, I was really excited to be able to kind of come in and ride shotgun with me on this. So thank you very much for being available and being a part of this. Today's agenda, as Larita mentioned, we've got a little bit of a short window. We were scheduled for 30 minutes, even though we may run over a little bit. So we're going to cover a very, very quick compliance overview. We're going to focus most of the session on Microsoft 365, as well as the different versions of it. And then we'll talk a little bit about licensing strategies, and then just finish up with a quick slide about C3 and who we are. So again, don't want to spend a ton of time on compliance, but it's important to just kind of set the table a little bit from what we are going to be talking about from a licensing standpoint. Obviously, this is all about protecting CUI data and the various compliance requirements that we have that kind of build around that. It's really more than one target. CMMC gets a ton of the press these days, but we can't forget about things like DFARS, NIST 800-171, and ITAR as well. So when we talk about controlled unclassified information, again, at this point, most folks have probably heard that term. They're seeing it in both the regular press as well as our contracts on a regular basis. CUI is handled and managed by the National Archives, and the idea is to standardize the way we control information. Effectively, CUI is effectively data that is not classified, but really should not be in the public domain. There are over 20 categories that are managed by the National Archives that are considered CUI in some form or fashion. And generally, when we're talking about defense data, we're talking about things like controlled technical information, export controlled content, as well as some other kind of niche type of things like naval nuclear propulsion and other types of forms of data. So when we talk about our compliance, and just doing a little baselining here, as I mentioned, CMMC level 2 kind of gets all the press at this point. That's what we're seeing in the news. That's what we're seeing. It is going to be a requirement for contractors to continue to do business with the DoD. The two big things to really talk about CMMC is that it's built and based around NIST 800-171, which in a lot of ways is kind of becoming the standard for contractors in terms of securing cybersecurity. NIST 800-171 is the reference point, and the control piece from CMMC level 2 is, of course, the third-party assessments, where a third party will come in and do an actual assessment to see if you are compliant and doing everything you say you're doing to be compliant. Now, when we talk about NIST 800-171, NIST 800-171 is about 110 controls that really cover a wide range of aspects, everything from physical security to security training to access control and how are you protecting access to your environments, managing your devices, doing security monitoring. The whole spectrum of things are covered within NIST 800-171. And probably the document that's almost as important as 171 right now is 171A. That actually takes NIST 171 and 110 controls and expands it to 320 assessment objectives. And to put it kind of bluntly, if you're looking for what's the answers to the test around 110, 171A is that test. It's all of the assessment objectives an assessor is going to come in and use to grade whether or not you're doing what you should be doing. I should probably also mention there's an appendix there, Appendix E, that talks about NFO controls. Don't sleep on those. Those are things that the government assumed were being done and didn't even bother to put a control on them, but they are still relevant. Things like your SSP are actually in that Appendix E and NFO controls. Now, two other topics that we want to also cover very quickly is DFARS 7012 and ITAR. DFARS 7012 is kind of the granddaddy of CMMC Level 2. It's been around since 2017 or so, and it really has three major components to it. All cloud service providers, cloud system providers should adhere to at least an equivalent of FedRAMP moderate. If you're holding CUI, DFARS 7012 calls for you to be compliant with NIST 800-171. And then it also has clauses C through G, which when we look at kind of the idea of the NIST cybersecurity framework with protect, detect, respond, recover, kind of that spectrum of capability, C through G starts to talk a little bit about forensics. It requires you to report a breach within 72 hours of finding it. It requires you to capture a certain amount of information and data that's built around identifying what was used to attack your system, as well as how much data was compromised. And then finally, we use ITAR. A lot of ways we use ITAR as a catch-all, but the main requirement here is content that requires data sovereignty. Things like ITAR that require data sovereignty means that not only does that data need to reside in the US, but it can only be accessed by US persons. And that becomes really important when we start looking at versions of the cloud, as well as what is eligible and what isn't eligible. So moving right along, in terms of Microsoft 365, well, Microsoft 365 is a lot. This is a placemat, and the link on the bottom will be able to show you how to get there of really everything that's in Microsoft 365 Enterprise E5. And you can see there's a tremendous amount of capabilities. We're not going to go through that line by line today, but I wanted to illustrate that there is a lot of features and a lot of capabilities in 365. But when we start to kind of break that down, Microsoft 365 is really three primary solution sets. There's Office 365, which was the original. That includes things like your Office apps, Word, Excel, PowerPoint, Outlook. It includes your email services, as well as collaboration around Teams and SharePoint and OneDrive. And that's really the communications and collaboration suite that's associated with Microsoft 365. Next, we layer on what's predominantly the security stack on top of Office 365, which originally was known as Enterprise Mobility and Security. That term is still used when we start breaking down the licensing. And that includes the capabilities around device and mobile management, things like Intune, information protection, privileged identity management, as well as the Defender series for cloud apps, endpoint, identity, that whole series, that whole family of capabilities. And then finally, the third piece of Microsoft 365 is really, it was originally called Windows Enterprise. And that's where we get capabilities like the EDR functionality of Defender for Endpoint, as well as threat hunting, threat analytics, and Windows Firewall as well. This is important as we start talking a little bit about licensing. We'll start to understand, and things will ring true in terms of what license terminology means and how it corresponds. So, as we mentioned before, there are a couple of different versions of Microsoft 365. There is the commercial version, GCC, as well as GCC High. And really, GCC at the end of the day was, or in the beginning of the day really, was built to support federal, state, local, and tribal governments that, and as well as contractors that are holding or processing data on behalf of the government. GCC High was actually custom built for DoD as well as DoD contractors holding or processing controlled unclassified information, or data that might be subjected to ITAR. So what's this mean? When we look at the different versions of Microsoft 365, we usually use this chart to illustrate it because it really graphically shows where different versions live and what the relevancy is to each one of those versions. Now, if we start in the top left-hand corner with Microsoft Enterprise, that's the worldwide version or the commercial version of Microsoft 365. It includes Office 365 as well as the EMS capabilities, and you'll notice that all of that lives in the commercial version of Azure. This is fantastic. It works really well. It's been a tremendous success. But as you can see below there, Azure Commercial will not only guarantee data residency, but unfortunately, it also has a global support administration model. That means if someone is working on Microsoft 365 from the Microsoft side of the house, whether that's client-facing or back-end support, there's a really high probability that that person is a non-US person or someone from overseas. So when Microsoft started looking at how to sell to the federal government, as well as state and local, they realized there are other requirements beyond what they normally do for security that they were required to meet. Things like CGIS, IRS 1075, and they got to a point where they recognized in order for them to meet the requirements the federal government was going to ask of them, they really needed to carve a data enclave out of the commercial version of Office 365. And this is what started with GCC. GCC works very well. Again, it was designed for federal, civilian, state, and local governments. Really works fantastically, but it does still live in Azure Commercial. This became a problem when the government started looking at how to sell into the Defense Department. And quickly, the stakes got raised. There was an elevated set of requirements around data residency and data sovereignty. And as a result, Microsoft wound up building a completely separate version, a replica of Azure called Azure Government. Now, with Office 365 DoD, this is where you would land if you are Navy.mil or Army.mil or in the uniformed services. Then Microsoft then created GCC High to support contractors that also have that export control requirement. Azure Government will fully support data residency as well as U.S. person support administration, which enables Microsoft to be able to attest for those requirements. Now, when we look at this a little bit of a different way, and thanks to our friends at Microsoft, this is a chart that we pulled out of one of their public blogs that we'll also send as part of the follow-up information. We can see very clearly what the compliance profile is for each version of the cloud. With commercial, we're not going to be able to support DFARS 7012. We're only going to be able to support CMMC level 1, and we're not going to be able to support ITAR or EAR data. With GCC, about a year ago, Microsoft came out and they said, you know what? We can support clauses C through G. We can handle, and therefore we can handle all of DFARS 7012. So there are situations, there are scenarios where GCC is an appropriate answer for folks that are looking for level 2 compliance with CMMC, DFARS 7012 compliance, but do not need that data sovereignty requirement. As soon as you move into what we call CUI specified or a data sovereignty requirement, things like ITAR required export controls, that's what's going to push most clients into a GCC high type of environment. Now, when we look at how Microsoft can support CMMC or Microsoft 365 can support CMMC, a really helpful tool is the CMMC placemat. And again, the link will be on the slides that we provide there. And what it does is it's a really helpful tool to cross-reference how various capabilities can support individual controls around NIST 800-171. Now, while Microsoft can help support over 80% of the coverage in cloud-only environments, coverage doesn't necessarily mean compliance. The capability is there, but there still may be configurations required to that service. There's certainly ongoing management and administration that's required. And there's generally documentation around policies and procedures that are also going to be required to be fully compliant with an individual control. A couple of notable exceptions that Microsoft 365 doesn't cover are certainly things that are on-premise, things like firewalls, servers, switches, that sort of thing, as well as non-technical controls, things like trainings, physical security, guest logs, background checks. That's not within the scope of what a Microsoft 365 solution will cover. So at this point, Scott, I'll pass the torch over to you to talk a little bit about some different licensing strategies.
All right, thank you, Bill. So when we think about licensing strategies, we generally have a handful of different ideas here, right? This is going to depend on how your organization is managing their users. Some organizations have a mixture of common office workers, general users, information workers. Some are using contractors or maybe third parties, or potentially even have folks that are working on GFE and don't have the same requirements for Microsoft services. So we're going to kind of break down those different user groups, and as we go through this, one of the first things we do is think about what's the right cloud. Bill touched on a little bit on GCC versus GCC High and the data sovereignty that lies between the two. That's an important decision. Migrating data into a cloud or out of a cloud and into another cloud are complex processes. They have interruptions to service flows, and there is a full redeployment. At this time, Microsoft doesn't have a copy paste button to take all of your settings from tenant A and put them into tenant B. So determining which is the right cloud for you will be really helpful. Then we think about, can we segment the business? Do we have a subset of users that are going to be working within this environment? If only a small subset of the environment or of the end users are responsive to this, an enclave starts to make a lot of sense because you can gain some cost savings. While we're thinking about enclaves, we need to talk about endpoints. Do we want to issue either a separate physical device, or is going through a virtual desktop maybe more applicable? There's different options there and pros and cons to both. Additionally, with our endpoints, we need to talk about endpoint management. How are we going to configure these endpoints? How are we going to make sure that they have a baseline configuration that's going to keep them secure, that's going to enforce authentication settings, patch our computers, all those kinds of fun things that become hygiene factors, but are important in your cybersecurity program. We have a strong preference towards Intune, which is built into that Microsoft 365 cloud. And then finally, EDR, right? The new versions of antivirus. How are we going to keep our endpoints secure? Are we going to go through the Defender for Endpoint route, or potentially do we look for a third-party service? Bill, next slide. So we have different options, right? We talk about our information workers. So these are, think of your standard employee, somebody who's working within the environment on a day in, day out basis. They're using the full productivity of the Office 365 suite. And we have a few different options. First one is an all features, meaning that they're going full in on the Microsoft stack. They might be using Azure Virtual Desktop. They may have an integrated EDR using Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. They're using Microsoft for Voice and Power Apps. They're using Microsoft's built-in log retention. And for these folks, the Microsoft G5 makes a lot of sense. It's an all-in-one license bundle that will cover all of these features. There's also another option for our general user, where maybe they're not using AVD, maybe you have an existing contract for an antivirus or EDR and you're not quite ready to move away from it, or potentially you're looking for a more cost-sensitive approach. For here, there's a few different license bundles. Microsoft loves their bundle of bundles, so stay with me here. We're looking at an Office 365 E3, the Enterprise Mobility and Security E5, and the Defender for Office 365 Plan 2. This gives you the full Office productivity suite, the SharePoint, the Office apps, Teams, email, all that kind of fun stuff. It also includes your endpoint management. It includes some security features through Azure AD Premium 2, as well as Cloud App Security. And it'll add in Defender for Office 365 Plan 2, so you have a robust spam filter for your email, as well as threat and analytics, so you can see what's going on there. Third, we have our Azure Virtual Desktop user, right? These are folks where they require the use of AVD. Potentially, they're not issued a company computer, so this might be a contractor that's working for us. And they're already using a separate EDR solution. For these folks, we're looking at the Microsoft 365 G3, the Azure Active Directory Plan 2, and the Defender for Office 365 Plan 2. Once again, this gives you the full Office productivity suite, includes your endpoint management, which you'll need to be able to manage your AVD instances. And then it also gives you the identity protection and your spam filter that we spoke about. Bill, next slide. When we think about our user groups, we also have frontline workers. So these folks are potentially working on a shop floor. maybe they're issued GFE and they're only really checking email from time to time about the company picnic or potentially to do timesheets. For these folks, we're assuming that they're not receiving a company issued computer. They can work just fine off of web applications such as Word Online or Excel Online because they're just really using it for a lightweight purpose. And they don't need a lot of storage, right? They're really only receiving a minimal number of emails and they don't have a high degree of storage requirements for OneDrive for Business. For these folks, there's two different license options. Inside of GCC, we have an Office 365 F3, EMS E3, Defender for Office 365 Plan 2, and Azure AD Plan 2. And then in GCC High, we look at the Microsoft 365 F3, Microsoft 365 F5 with the security and compliance add-in. A note there on GCC and GCC High, this is where the license modalities get really interesting between the two. They are not always analogous. So it becomes really important if you're working with a partner about your Microsoft licenses, ask them the differences. Ask them about GCC and GCC High because there's not a one-to-one relationship in the licenses. As we think about our administrators, our technology admins are going in, these are the security related folks. We usually recommend a pretty tight posture on them, right? Keep a small attack surface. So for these individuals, we recommend the Azure AD P2 license as a standalone license. There's no email address, there's no Office Productivity Suite. They don't really need this. This is intended to be a separate account that's only really used if they're making changes to the system. So let's just give it those identity protection items that are really required. Next slide. In addition to the bundles that I spoke about, there's some common add-ons, right? Some of these are the NFR controls that Bill talked about, such as our backup, right? We want to make sure that backups are FedRAMP approved or authorized. And we also want to make sure we have proper authentication and retention controls on those. Think about your voice services. How are we going to make phone calls, right? Something just as basic as we need to call somebody. How are we going to do it? Are we going to use audio conferencing and PSTN? And if so, do we go direct routing or do we use a third party? We're happy to talk to you about the differences and how those operate. Also, what about other Microsoft services? Think about Visio or Planner, for example. There's options in licensing both of those in both GCC and GCC High. And then we touched on your endpoint management, or excuse me, endpoint EDR. Do you want to go with Defender or Endpoint, or do you want to look at a third-party system? So in purchasing GCC and GCC High, I mentioned that there's different modalities, right? And I won't lie, it gets cumbersome. There's a lot of differences that are very minute, but will be material in which license you choose. GCC, most resellers have access to sell this, right? It's a complex sell, to be quite honest with you, but most retailers have availability to do it. GCC High, on the other side, it's limited to AOSG partners and available for EAs. So if you have a larger shop, an EA might be an option for you. Pricing wise, GCC is very similar to commercial. You're not going to see any material changes there. GCC High, on the other side, you will see generally a 50% bump in comparison to commercial and GCC. And then billing mechanisms on your GCC, you're going to be billed monthly versus an annual billing for GCC High.
Great. Thanks, Scott. That's fantastic. Wonder if you can all hear my dog sneezing in the background over here. Couple things just about us C3 as we kind of get closer to the bottom half of the hour here. C3 Integrated Solutions, we've been around for 11 years as a Microsoft partner. One of the things that we're distinguished with is the fact that we've got over 6 years of experience in GCC High. We were one of the first 5 AOSG partners. We've been around for a while. And as Scott started to touch on, not all clouds are the same. There's different versions, different options. They evolve at different paces as well. Different features roll out at different times for all of them, so there's not always parity there. We do have over 450 clients in Microsoft 365. Almost half of those are in GCC High itself. So that gives us a really deep experience working with NIST, DFARS, as well as ITAR as well. You can kind of see some of our accolades across the bottom there, certainly being part of the Cyber AB program as an RPO, as well as a couple of other pieces in there as well. So with that, Larita, I'll pass it back over to you to see if we have any questions.
Absolutely. Thanks, Bill, and thanks, Scott. So we do have a couple of questions that have come in. The first is, do you recommend getting GCC High now, even if you do not have DoD contracts?
It depends on the contracts you're going to have. When we sit down with our clients, we try to talk a little bit about what's that business strategy for that organization, what is the type of work that you plan to do, and will that data hold either CUI data and or export controlled data. And then at a certain point, that becomes a little bit of a business decision along that way as well. If you are near term, 3, 6, even 12 months out, and you're making investments into your cybersecurity, we generally recommend you move to the right cloud first. Because if you're going to make investments into cybersecurity, and then a year from now you figure out you're in the wrong cloud, that's a full data migration as well as a full deployment in terms of what you need to do to reset that bar, and then you're kind of starting from scratch again from a compliance standpoint. So we would tend to recommend move to the right version of the cloud as soon as possible, and then build around that foundation.
Great, thanks so much. By the way, just as a reminder, folks, I've got a couple of questions here about sharing the slides. We will be sharing the slides after the call. We'll send a link out to them as well as the accompanying ebook. And for those of you that have questions and haven't answered them, asked them yet, feel free to go ahead and put that in the GoToWebinar control panel. Another question that we have here is, if we need to spin up VMs or if we want to use Azure Kubernetes services with Microsoft 365, will Microsoft 365 provide services?
Graham, sorry, you broke up a little bit on there in terms of the Azure portion.
Yeah, I can field this one, Bill. So the answer to that is it'll require both Microsoft 365 services as well as Azure. So when you think about any time you're using an Azure service, whether it's VMs or Kubernetes or really anything sitting, even just Azure storage, you're going to have identity and access controls that are going to tie into, at minimum, that Azure AD P2 license that we spoke about. If you're using virtual machines, depending on the purpose of those, if it's VDI or some sort of RDS type use case, you might want to look at the productivity suite for those persons. If it's just serving as a typical server role, you could probably get away from using the Office 365 services, the productivity suite, and just look at security related licensing, whether that be the EMS or potentially just standalone licenses. Also, as you're looking at your Azure services for Kubernetes and VMs, you probably want to look at like Defender for Cloud, potentially Defender for IoT, depending on what you're putting up there, because this will help you secure and baseline those devices.
Great, thanks so much, Scott. You mentioned some of the cost differences between GCC and GCC High. What order of magnitude are we talking about here?
Yeah, so they're on each individual license is a little bit different. As we mentioned, GCC, you can purchase that on a monthly basis. For example, the M365 G5 runs around $57 per month, which translates to about $684 a year. GCC High, on the other hand, you have to buy from an annual perspective and an annual license, and that's going to run closer to $1,120. So there is a little bit of a spread between the two licenses. Similar gaps, although they vary a little bit, go across the whole licensing spectrum.
Great, thanks, Bill. Here's another interesting question. How does licensing work if you're just creating an enclave versus moving your entire company over?
So regardless of whether you're moving your entire company or doing an enclave type strategy, you are purchasing a separate tenant of Microsoft 365. More often than not, that's a separate license agreement. So it is literally setting up a separate IT environment, including all the way back into the contractual component. There are situations with larger companies, if you have an enterprise agreement, they may be able to put both types of licenses on the same contract. But in all other cases, you're really doing two separate agreements.
Great. What does the eligibility process actually look like for GCC High, and what are the requirements?
So with GCC High, what you need to do is there's a web form that you fill out that you are going to maintain and represent that you are holding CUI type of data. That will go in, and Microsoft will evaluate that. They will do a little bit of a background check. The requirement's a fairly low bar. Last time I looked, it was really effectively, are you doing work with the government today, is essentially how they're going to validate that. Depending on what that answer is, they may come back and ask for a proof of a contract that requires CUI. But generally, that process happens fairly quickly. We've seen it turn around in less than a week.
Awesome. In one of the slides, you mentioned that some of those packages require a separate EDR tool. Are there recommendations that you have for that?
So I'm a big fanboy defender for endpoint. I will self-confess to that. But CrowdStrike also makes a really good tool. They're neck and neck. A lot of times it comes down to the individual endpoints that are being secured and potentially at a price point.
Yeah, it's a great point. Whenever you look at that Gartner quadrant, both of those are up on the top right side, and everyone's kind of lagging behind on it.
Here's another question that is with regard to sort of CMMC compliance, and this is a big question, honestly, is, what other things beyond GCC High does one need to be thinking about for, when they're thinking about the CMMC compliance? What are the other components?
It starts with, when a lot of times we take a couple steps back when we start with our clients to talk again about what is your business strategy, how well can you segment your business, your defense business from the rest of your company? Can you even do that? Those are going to be some of those initial conversations, initial decisions around a data enclave or going all in. That's really a big driver in terms of how do you start looking at what your strategy is. Another component that we look at is how do you minimize the amount of CUI you hold and where you hold it. So other systems like a CRM system or a financial system, are those going to be within or outside of your system security boundary, are also considerations that we kind of talk to folks about and make sure that they're considering it.
Scott, I would kind of add in on that. If you're a little down the process in CMMC and you're potentially you have other compliance matrices that you've already successfully completed, or maybe you've just started to work on your journey already, one of the key things is be brutally honest with yourself. There's a study that came out that the self-assessment scores as opposed to a DFARS assessed organization is about a 100-point swing. So organizations that were submitting their SBRS score were coming in at a positive 56, and post a DFARS assessment, they're coming in at a negative 57, despite going against the same controls. I find that really interesting because when I work with customers, in particular on the SBRS, I find them kind of going, yeah, I think we're good enough. And as we start digging into it and asking some questions, they're like, maybe we're not. So if you're unsure, lean towards no and see if you can really improve that particular area.
It's a great point, Scott.
Great. The last question kind of leads into, we do have another webinar coming up on May 24th. We'll send that out and the link to it for folks that do have more questions with regard to kind of CMMC, but also just their compliance requirements in general. There's a lot of overlapping requirements. And so that'll be happening on May 24th, and we'll send you the link. We promised that we would get you guys out of here in 30 minutes. We went 5 minutes over for some of these Q&A, but if you have additional questions, please let us know. Either send them in here now, or go ahead and email them either to Bill and Scott, whose email addresses that you have on the screen there. And in the meantime, Really appreciate your attending the session today. We hope that you found today's webinar informative and useful. Bill and Scott, appreciate your expertise and your time here as well. At this point, we'll look forward to sending you those materials, and we'll see you hopefully on the next webinar. Thanks so much, everyone.